What if I told you a Tennessee moonshiner figured out how to make 600 horsepower from a Chrysler Hemi using illegal fuel that the factory engineers never even tested? This isn't some tall tale from the backwoods. This is the story of how Wendell Scott outsmarted one of America's greatest engine designs with nothing but moonshine knowledge and raw determination. Picture this. It's 1965 at a dusty drag strip somewhere in rural Tennessee. The air is thick with tire smoke and exhaust fumes. Big block Mopars, Fords, and Chevys are lined up, their owners bragging about cam specs and compression ratios. Then a beat-up Plymouth pulls up to the line. The driver is Wendell Scott, a black man in a sport that's overwhelmingly white, in the Deep South no less. The competition snickers. They stop laughing when his Hemi launches like it's been shot from a cannon, pulling away from cars that cost 3 times as much. What they don't know is that Scott is running a fuel mixture so potent, so effective, that it would be banned from street use entirely. He's pouring moonshine straight into his gas tank. This is the story of how a moonshine runner turned drag racer discovered a fuel formula that extracted 200 more horsepower than anyone thought possible from Chrysler's legendary Hemi engine. It's about outsmarting corporate engineering with backwoods chemistry, and it's about a man who used every trick he learned running illegal liquor through the Tennessee hills to become NASCAR's first black driver. To understand what Scott accomplished, we need to travel back to 1964 when Chrysler unleashed the 426 Hemi onto the world. This engine was already a monster. Chrysler engineers had spent millions developing it for NASCAR competition. The basic architecture was revolutionary. Hemispherical combustion chambers allowed for massive valves. Intake valves measured 2.25 inches. Exhausts were 1.94 inches. That's bigger than most engines today. The valve angle was optimized at 58 degrees for maximum flow. The result was an engine that could move more air than anything else on the market. The street version, released in 1966, was detuned from its racing brother but still made 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. These were conservative ratings. Most dynos showed closer to 470 horsepower. The compression ratio was set at 10.351, carefully calculated for 91-octane pump gas. Any higher, and you'd get detonation, pre-ignition, that sounds like marbles in a blender and destroys pistons faster than you can say, warranty void. Chrysler's engineers had done their homework. They tested the Hemi with every grade of pump gasoline available. They experimented with timing curves, carburetor jetting, cam profiles. They documented everything. What they didn't test was alcohol. Why would they? Alcohol fuel was for Indy cars and funny cars, not street machines. The fuel system wasn't designed for it. Alcohol is corrosive to standard fuel lines. It attacks. Carburetor floats, and it requires completely different air-fuel ratios. Running alcohol through a pump gas engine was asking for trouble. But Wendell Scott wasn't a Chrysler engineer. He was a moonshiner. Scott had been running illegal liquor through the Tennessee and Virginia hills since the late 1940s. In that business, you learned things that no engineering school would teach. You learned that pure grain alcohol, the kind that came out of a good still at 190 proof, had incredible anti-knock properties. You learned that mixing alcohol with gasoline could create fuel blends that burned cooler and more completely than straight gas. Most importantly, you learned that if you wanted to outrun the revenue agents, you needed every horsepower you could get. The physics behind alcohol fuel are fascinating. Ethanol has an octane rating of approximately 113, but that's not the whole story. When you blend it with gasoline, something interesting happens. The cooling effect of alcohol evaporation actually lowers combustion chamber temperatures during the compression stroke. This allows you to run compression ratios that would destroy an engine on pump gas. We're talking 14.1 even 15-1 in some cases. The alcohol also burns more completely, extracting more energy from each combustion event. Scott's formula was elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. He mixed his fuel 50-50, half 190 proof moonshine, half high-test gasoline. This gave him an effective octane rating somewhere north of 120. For perspective, today's premium pump gas is 93 octane. Race gas is typically 110. Scott was running fuel that made race gas look weak, but octane was only part of the equation. Scott had to completely recalibrate the engine to take advantage of this superfuel. Alcohol requires a much richer air-fuel mixture than gasoline, about 40% more fuel for the same amount of air. Scott drilled out his carburetor jets, going from 72s in the primary to 85s. The secondaries went from 76s to 92s. These are massive increases. He also advanced the timing significantly. Where the factory called for 36 degrees total advance, Scott was running 42, sometimes 44 degrees. The real magic happened with compression. Scott had his engine rebuilt with custom pistons that raised the compression ratio to 14.1. On pump gas, this engine would have detonated itself to pieces in seconds. On his moonshine mixture, it sang. The combination of high compression, aggressive timing, and super high octane fuel transformed the already powerful Hemi into something otherworldly. The results were staggering. While pump gas Hemis were making 425 to 470 horsepower, Scott's alcohol-fueled monster was putting down over 600 horsepower at the rear wheels. That's not flywheel horsepower, that's actual measured power at the tires. Factor in drivetrain losses, and his engine was probably making close to 700 horsepower at the crank from a naturally aspirated engine. In 1965, here's where it gets interesting. The competition had no idea what Scott was doing. They could hear his engine was different. It had a distinctive sharp crack to the exhaust note that gasoline engines didn't produce. They could smell something was different too. Alcohol exhaust has a sweet, almost pleasant smell compared to gasoline. But in the world of drag racing, everyone had secrets. As long as you weren't running nitromethane or other specifically banned substances, nobody asked too many questions. Scott's first major victory with the alcohol Hemi came at a small strip outside Knoxville. He was running a stripped-down 1965 Plymouth Belvedere, primer gray with mismatched wheels. The car looked like hell, but it was all business under the hood. His first-round opponent was a local favorite, running a 427 Ford, with all the best parts money could buy. The Ford driver laughed when he saw Scott's raggedy Plymouth. He wasn't laughing when Scott's 60-foot time came up 1.42 seconds. That was professional-level performance from what looked like a junkyard special. The Plymouth launched so hard, it pulled the front wheels 6 inches off the ground. By the time they crossed the 8th-mile marker, Scott was 3 car lengths ahead. He ran a 10.84 at 128 miles per hour. The Ford managed only 11.92 at 118. It wasn't even close. Word spread quickly through the pits. Who was this guy, and what the hell was in that Plymouth? As Scott continued to dominate at drag strips across the Southeast, other racers tried to figure out his secret. Some thought he had a hidden nitrous system. Others suspected he was running a distroked motor with exotic internals. A few even accused him of having a disguised racing Hemi, not the street version. Nobody suspected the truth, that he was essentially running Indy car fuel in a street engine. The technical challenges Scott faced were immense. Alcohol fuel doesn't just require different jetting and timing. It's hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs water from the atmosphere. Leave an alcohol blend sitting for a few days and it would separate, with the water-contaminated alcohol settling to the bottom of the tank. Scott had to mix fresh fuel for every race. He also had to replace fuel lines every few months as the alcohol slowly ate through the rubber. Carburetor floats would fail without warning. Fuel pumps designed for gasoline would cavitate with the thinner alcohol mixture. But Scott had solutions for everything. He used aircraft fuel lines made of alcohol-resistant synthetic rubber. He modified his fuel pump with stiffer springs and larger check valves. He made his own carburetor floats from closed-cell foam that wouldn't absorb alcohol. Every modification was born from necessity and refined through trial and error. There were no instruction manuals for what he was doing. The most impressive aspect of Scott's setup was how he managed heat. Alcohol fuel actually burns cooler than gasoline, about 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit compared to 3,900 for gas. But with 14.1 compression and advanced timing, his combustion pressures were extreme. Chrysler's engineers had designed the Hemi's cooling system for street use with 10.25.1 compression. Scott was asking it to handle 40% more combustion pressure. His solution was elegant. He drilled additional water passages in the block, connecting coolant channels that were normally separate. He used a high-flow water pump from a motorhome application. He ran straight water with water wetter additive instead of antifreeze, which actually reduces cooling efficiency. Most cleverly, he used the alcohol fuel itself as a coolant. The evaporating alcohol in the intake manifold dropped intake temperatures by 80 degrees. Cooler intake charge meant denser air, which meant more power. By mid-1965, Scott was virtually unbeatable at bracket racing events across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. He was careful to avoid sanctioned events where fuel checks were mandatory. But at outlaw strips and grudge racing venues, he was king. His reputation grew to mythical proportions. Stories circulated about him outrunning police cars during his moonshine days, about secret test sessions at abandoned airstrips, about mysterious fuel formulas passed down through generations of moonshiners. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Yes, Scott had learned from older moonshiners about alcohol fuel, but he'd also spent countless hours with chemistry textbooks, learning about stoichiometric ratios and combustion dynamics. He understood that alcohol's high latent heat of vaporization, 396 BTU per pound compared to gasoline's 142, was key to controlling detonation. He knew that alcohol's single oxygen atom per molecule meant it brought its own oxidizer to the party, requiring less atmospheric oxygen for complete combustion. This is where Scott's story intersects with his larger racing career. The money and reputation he earned drag racing with his alcohol Hemi opened doors in NASCAR. But NASCAR was a different world. Fuel was strictly regulated. Every car ran the same Sunoco 260 GTX racing fuel. Scott couldn't use his alcohol advantage on the big ovals, but he could use everything else he'd learned. The attention to detail, the innovative thinking, the ability to make do with less. These skills transferred directly. When NASCAR teams were spending thousands on wind tunnel testing, Scott was taping yarn to his car and driving down country roads, watching how the air flowed. When other teams hired engineers, Scott relied on feel and intuition honed by years of making machines do things they weren't designed to do. The Chrysler engineers, had they known about Scott's alcohol experiments, would have been horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Chrysler actually did develop alcohol fuel Hemis later for drag racing applications. The factory race Hemis of the late 1960s running on alcohol made 800-plus horsepower. But those were purpose-built racing engines with specialized components. Scott was doing it with basically stock parts and moonshine. Let's talk about what 600 horsepower meant in 1965. The fastest production car that year was arguably the 427 Cobra, which made 425 horsepower and cost $7,000, about $65,000 in today's money. A Ferrari 275 GTB made 280 horsepower and cost $1,400. Scott's Plymouth, which he bought used for $1,800, was making $600. He had more power than a Cobra and a Ferrari combined for less than the price of a new family sedan. But here's where the story gets complicated. Scott's fuel mixture was completely illegal for street use. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had strict regulations about alcohol fuel. You needed special permits. The fuel had to be denatured, poisoned so people couldn't drink it. Running moonshine in your gas tank was technically bootlegging. Scott was risking federal charges every time he filled up. There was also the safety issue. Alcohol burns with an almost invisible flame. If there was a fire, you might not see it until it was too late. Alcohol fires require different extinguishers. Water actually works, unlike with gasoline fires. Several drag strips banned alcohol fuel after accidents where safety crews couldn't see the flames they were trying to fight. Scott had contingencies for everything. He carried 2 fire extinguishers, one CO2 for electrical fires, one foam for alcohol. He wore Nomex underwear before it was required. He installed an automatic fire suppression system using aircraft parts, triggered by a temperature sensor in the engine bay. The man who'd spent years outrunning federal agents wasn't about to get caught off guard by safety issues. The most remarkable run of Scott's alcohol Hemi came in September 1965 at an unofficial event in Bristol. This wasn't a sanctioned race, more like organized street racing with a makeshift timing system. But the competition was serious. There were big block Chevys with tunnel ram intakes, Ford 427s with Weber carburetors, even a few other Hemis. Scott's Plymouth was giving up cubic inches to most of them. The biggest Chevys were 454s. Some of the Fords were stroked to 482 cubic inches. But displacement is only part of the equation. Scott's Ford 26 cubic inches were making 1.41 horsepower per cubic inch. The best pump gas engines there were doing maybe 1.1 per cube. When power to weight is calculated, Scott's stripped Belvedere at 3,200 pounds with 600 horsepower gave him 5.33 pounds per horsepower. A new Z06 Corvette today has about 5.8 pounds per horsepower. The racing that night was heads up, no handicaps. Scott won 7 races in a row. His best pass was a 10.72 at 131 miles per hour. The closest anyone got to him was a 454 Chevelle that ran 11.15. Scott was consistently 4 to 5 tenths quicker than cars with more displacement, better tires, and bigger budgets. The alcohol advantage was that significant. Word of Scott's dominance eventually reached Detroit. Engineers at Chrysler started asking questions. How was a privateer making their flagship engine produce numbers that their dyno rooms couldn't achieve? There were rumors that Chrysler sent engineers to observe Scott's car at various events, trying to decode his modifications. They never officially acknowledged this, but subsequent factory racing parts seemed influenced by some of Scott's innovations. The alcohol fuel revelation also spread through the racing community, though slowly. Racers are secretive by nature, and Scott wasn't advertising his methods. But you can't hide the smell of alcohol exhaust, and eventually others started experimenting. By 1967, alcohol classes were being established at major drag strips. What started as one moonshiner's secret became an entire category of racing. Scott's influence extended beyond just fuel. His approach to problem-solving, using unconventional materials, questioning factory specifications, applying knowledge from unrelated fields, became a blueprint for grassroots racing innovation. He proved that corporate engineering, for all its resources and expertise, could be outsmarted by someone willing to think differently. The technical legacy of Scott's alcohol Hemi experiments is significant. Today, E85 fuel, 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline, is available at many pumps. Modern performance enthusiasts use it for exactly the same reasons Scott used moonshine: higher octane, cooler combustion, more power potential. The only difference is that it's legal now. Turbocharged engines especially benefit from E85's properties. The Ford EcoBoost engines, GM's LT4, even the Dodge Hellcat, they all make significantly more power on E85 than pump gas. But there's something lost in the sanitized, EPA-approved world of modern E85. Scott wasn't just pouring different fuel in his tank, He was applying generations of outlaw knowledge to outsmart a massive corporation. He was taking skills, learned evading federal agents, and using them to embarrass wealthy racers. He was proving that innovation doesn't always come from engineering departments and test facilities. The danger element can't be ignored either. Every pass down the strip in that alcohol-burning Hemi was a risk. The engine was operating at stress levels it was never designed for. 14-to-1 compression with 44 degrees of timing is a recipe for catastrophic failure. One bad batch of fuel, one momentary lean condition, and you'd have pistons exiting through the hood. Scott ran that knife's edge for 2 full seasons without a major failure. That's not luck. That's deep mechanical understanding. Scott's transition to NASCAR in 1961 predated his alcohol Hemi experiments, but the success at drag strips helped fund his NASCAR efforts. Prize money from bracket racing bought tires, parts, and travel expenses for the Grand National Series. The reputation he built as a giant killer at drag strips helped him get past the many barriers facing a black driver in 1960s NASCAR. His NASCAR career statistics are modest: 1 official win, 20 top 5 finishes, 147 races over 13 years. But those numbers don't tell the real story. Scott was racing with equipment 2 to 3 years older than his competitors. He had no sponsors, no factory support, no crew beyond family members. He was changing his own tires during pit stops while other teams had specialized crews. The fact that he competed at all was remarkable. That he occasionally beat factory teams was miraculous. The alcohol Hemi gave Scott something crucial: respect. When other racers saw what he could do with an engine, they couldn't dismiss him as easily. He wasn't just some black guy trying to race with the white boys. He was an innovator, a threat, someone who understood machinery at a level that demanded acknowledgement. The same guys who might have objected to his presence in NASCAR couldn't argue with his elapsed times at the drag strip. There's a direct line from Scott's moonshine fuel experiments to modern motorsports. Today's NASCAR uses E15 fuel, 15% ethanol blend. IndyCar runs E85. The FIA World Rally Championship uses E85-based fuel. The properties that Scott discovered in 1965, alcohol's cooling effect, its detonation resistance, its power potential, are now standard knowledge. But Scott figured it out with moonshine and determination, not computer simulations and laboratory testing. The irony is that Chrysler could have discovered this themselves. They had the resources, the dynos, the engineers. But they were thinking inside the box of street-legal, warranty-covered, EPA-approved operation. Scott had no such constraints. He was thinking like a moonshiner. How do you make something go faster than anyone expects? How do you use every possible advantage, legal or otherwise? This speaks to a larger truth about innovation. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from outsiders, from people who don't know what's supposed to be impossible. Chrysler's engineers knew that running 14-1 compression on the street was impossible. Scott didn't know that, or didn't care. He just knew that moonshine let him do it, so he did. The specific chemistry of Scott's mixture was more sophisticated than just dumping white lightning in the tank. The 190-proof moonshine was crucial. Lower proof wouldn't have provided enough octane boost. The 50-50 ratio was carefully calibrated. Too much alcohol and the fuel system couldn't deliver enough volume. Too little, and he couldn't run the compression he wanted. The gasoline portion needed to be high test, at least 100-octane aviation gas when he could get it. The mixture had to be shaken, not stirred, to ensure complete blending. Temperature played a critical role. Scott discovered that pre-cooling his fuel to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit increased power by another 15-20 horsepower. The denser, cooler fuel provided more energy per volume. He'd pack his fuel jugs in ice before a race, then transfer the chilled mixture to the tank just before his run. This was another trick borrowed from moonshining: Cooler liquid is denser, so you can fit more product in the same space. The exhaust system needed modification too. Alcohol combustion produces more water vapor than gasoline. Stock mufflers would rust through in weeks. Scott ran straight pipes with turndowns just past the rear axle. The sound was ungodly, a sharp, angry bark that rattled windows a quarter-mile away. Track officials often made him add mufflers, which he'd install for tech inspection, then remove before his runs. The real genius of Scott's system was its simplicity. While other racers were experimenting with exotic fuels like nitropropane or hydrazine, Scott used something he could make himself if necessary. A good still, some corn mash, and patience could produce fuel. No chemical supply companies, no paper trails, no questions asked. It was completely self-sufficient, exactly how moonshiners liked things. The end of Scott's alcohol Hemi era came not from engine failure or regulatory crackdown, but from success. By 1967, his NASCAR career was demanding more time. He was racing 40-plus events a year in the Grand National Series. There wasn't time for drag racing anymore. The Plymouth was sold to a racer in Georgia who immediately converted it back to gasoline, not understanding what he'd bought. The new owner complained it wouldn't run right, not realizing the entire fuel system and engine calibration were set up for alcohol. Scott's innovations weren't entirely lost, though. He kept detailed notes, compression ratios, jet sizes, timing curves, fuel mixtures. Years later, these notes surfaced in the estate sale after his death in 1990. They were purchased by a chemical engineer who worked for a major oil company. That engineer later helped develop some of the early E85 performance calibrations for modern engines. The knowledge came full circle, from moonshine stills to corporate laboratories. Looking back, Scott's achievement seems almost impossible. He took an engine designed by some of the best engineers in Detroit and made it produce 40% more power using fuel that was illegal, dangerous, and completely outside normal automotive practice. He did it with hand tools and hard-earned knowledge. He did it while facing discrimination that would have stopped most people before they started. And he did it so successfully that he forced the racing world to acknowledge both his methods and his talent. The broader implications of Scott's story extend beyond racing. It's about knowledge systems, the formal education of Chrysler's engineers versus the practical education of moonshiners. It's about innovation happening at the margins, where necessity and creativity intersect. It's about how outsider status can become an advantage if you're willing to break rules others won't even question. Today's automotive world is increasingly locked down. Electronic engine management, encrypted software, proprietary diagnostics, it's getting harder for individuals to innovate the way Scott did. But his spirit lives on in every garage tuner who figures out how to flash an ECU for more boost, every racer who finds an extra tenth through unconventional setup, every enthusiast who refuses to accept factory limitations as final. The technical specifications of Scott's engine would still be impressive today. 600 naturally aspirated horsepower from 426 cubic inches. That's 1.41 horsepower per cubic inch without forced induction. Modern NASCAR engines, with all their technology and development, make about 1.88 horsepower per cubic inch. Scott was getting 75% of modern NASCAR power density using 1960s technology and moonshine. That's not just impressive, it's revolutionary. The risk Scott took went beyond mechanical failure. Running moonshine as fuel in 1965, Tennessee could have landed him in federal prison. The ATF didn't care that it was for racing. Untaxed alcohol was untaxed alcohol. Scott kept his fuel in mason jars, labeled as cleaning solvent. He transported it in a hidden compartment welded under his truck bed. The same hiding spots that once held illegal liquor now held illegal fuel. The irony wasn't lost on him. But perhaps the greatest testament to Scott's innovation is how normal it seems now. E85 conversions are common in the performance world. Flex fuel sensors automatically adjust timing and fuel delivery for different alcohol contents. What was once outlaw chemistry is now mainstream modification. Scott didn't just outsmart Chrysler, he outsmarted an entire industry's assumptions about what fuel could be. The Chrysler Hemi went on to become one of the most legendary engines in automotive history. It powered everything from muscle cars to top-fuel dragsters. But for one brief moment in the mid-1960s, a moonshiner from Tennessee showed Chrysler's engineers possibilities they hadn't imagined. He proved that sometimes the best engineering happens not in corporate laboratories, but in small garages where necessity meets ingenuity. Wendell Scott's alcohol-fueled Hemi wasn't just about making power. It was about making power on your own terms with your own knowledge in defiance of what everyone said was possible. What's the craziest fuel mixture you've ever heard of someone running? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever experimented with E85 or alternative fuels in your own builds. And if you enjoyed this story of grassroots innovation beating corporate engineering, make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started with tales of automotive rebels who refuse to accept the limits others set for them.